1963's March on Washington reverberated through America, adjusting public perspectives, private beliefs, and general attitudes. Behind its grand legacy stood what Martin Luther King claimed was the only civil rights activist capable of pulling off protests of such unprecedented scale. Enter Bayard Rustin, prime organizer of the March on Washington. Organizing his first strike while he was still in college, Rustin sought opportunity to fight America's discriminatory racial constructs restlessly. Rustin's unwavering nature placed him at the helm of early civil rights protests and atop a wide variety of parties and organizations. Through ceaseless action, he laid the civil rights movement's early foundation, combating undaunted racism along the way. But perhaps his greatest enemy resided within himself, as Rustin was openly homosexual, a trait that eventually saw him cast from his own movement's front lines. In spite of his social limitation, his ability to lead the violently oppressed towards pacifism marks him as one of the greatest black social architects of our time. 1940s America remained chained to strictly enforced racial segregation. Jim Crow laws dominated Southern black lives by institutionalizing economic and social disadvantages, which simultaneously deprived blacks of the tools necessary for their own societal advancement. Where the laws were not in place, whites continued to exercise their dominions through violence with little to no consequence. 1943's race riots resulted in hundreds of injuries for blacks and proved fatal for 25 more. The inferior Negro was a crucial cultural norm, one that most whites accepted as an indisputable fact. Blacks rejected this notion by achieving in music, sports, and establishing higher education. African American participation in World War II spurred whites to value blacks as potentially beneficial human beings rather than incapable savages. Activism emerged from these cracks in white supremacy, prompting organizations such as the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP, to seize chances at promoting equality. Early civil rights found solid ground in the year 1941 when Philip A. Randolph, mentor and friend to Bayard Rustin, proposed the first March on Washington.
Born March 17, 1912, Bayard Rustin was raised as a Quaker pacifist amongst legendary civil rights activists. His grandmother's affiliation with the NAACP saw prominent leaders W. E. B. Du Bois and Mary McLeod Bethune as frequent household guests. While studying at City College in 1932, Rustin joined the Young Communist League. Drawn to what he believed the Communists' commitment to racial justice, Rustin left the organization in 1941 when asked to halt his program to recruit black youth and focus purely on the European war effort. Rustin's public personality and organizational skill were now sought after, and later that year he was recruited by A. Philip Randolph to organize the first March on Washington. In protest of discrimination in war industries and segregation in American armed forces, they planned to lead some 50,000 blacks to the Capitol. President Franklin Theodore Roosevelt acquiesced and immediately issued the Fair Employment Act, ending discrimination in war industries. Satisfied, Randolph canceled 1941's March on Washington. Bayard, however, advocated for further action. The following year, Rustin's deep commitment to pacifism and racial equality cost him dearly when he was savagely beaten and arrested after refusing to relinquish his seat on a bus. During the beating, he is quoted as calmly stating, "There is no need to beat me, for I am not resisting." He soon found himself associated with FOR, the Fellowship of Reconciliation, an international religious pacifist organization. Bayard headed their department on race relations and became close to FOR's executive director, A.J. Muste. Through FOR, Rustin led the first Freedom Rides, which would become a model for those in 1961. In order to test America's federal law of banning racial discrimination in interstate travel, 7 pairs of men, each team comprised of 1 black and 1 white, rode front row in segregated buses. Each member was arrested several times throughout their journey, culminating in Rustin serving 22 days on a North Carolina chain gang. For the next 6 years, Rustin refused to be content, forming the American Committee on Africa and traveling to India to learn methods of nonviolent resistance. Unbeknownst to Bayard, his illustrious career would soon come crashing down in a torrent of social condemnation. January 21, 1953. Bayard Rustin is discovered having homosexual intercourse with 2 young men in a parked car. The trio is arrested on charges of lewd vagrancy. Powerless, Rustin pleads guilty and is sentenced to 60 days in prison. He is not ashamed of his homosexuality, but of his carelessness in letting his fellow activists down. An invisible boundary is erected around Rustin, severing his ability to act freely. His homosexuality, public for the first time, is now a weapon for any opposing the causes he fought so desperately for. The social implications are so thoroughly negative that A.J. Musty, a man that considered Bayard a son, forces him to resign from the Fellowship of Reconciliation. 3 years after his public humiliation, Martin Luther King recognized the advantages of Rustin's contacts, knowledge, and organizational abilities, and invited him to serve as his advisor. Both were well aware that Rustin's background would be controversial with other civil rights leaders, prompting Rustin to maintain a low profile and rarely speak publicly. Under Rustin's influence, King dismissed the armed security guarding his household and put complete faith in nonviolence. In 1963, 22 years after canceling the original, A. Philip Randolph suggested a second march on Washington. At the protest of activists Roy Wilkins and Andrew Young, Randolph once again appointed Rustin as chief organizer. With renewed vitality, Bayard Rustin directed the civil rights movement's most essential climax. When the time came, it was not Martin Luther King, but Philip A. Randolph and Bayard Rustin on the cover of Life magazine.
America had never seen protests on such enormous scale. Bayard Rustin and his team of 200 activists publicized the march, recruited the marchers, coordinated the buses and trains, provided the marshals, and set up and administered all the logistic details with resounding success. The march built immense political momentum, resulting in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Bayard, however, realized it caused a pivotal shift in how the movement operates. In his book From Protest to Politics, Rustin acknowledged that in order for full equality to occur, they must shift institutional and structural impediments to full equality, as opposed to protesting it from the outside, and he did just that.
He stated, "Instead of marching on the courthouse, we must now march on the ballot box." For a decade leading up to the march, Rustin had been invisible and all but influence. His newfound recognition gave him sway on whatever political issue he chose to fight for. In contrast to his fellow civil rights leaders, Rustin did not refocus his talents to Vietnam War protest. He knew the fight for civil rights was not dead. When questioned, he responded, "Someday this war will be over, and it's my job to make sure those black men returning will return to something decent." Utilizing momentum from the march, he co-founded the A. Philip Randolph Institute in 1965 and married civil rights with the labor movement. Rustin's advisory of Martin Luther King altered the course of American history. While King stood at the threshold of racial revolution, Rustin taught him the fundamental importance of nonviolence. In this, he provided the civil rights movement both practical strategy and moral cause. Rustin's early protests were the blueprint for King to follow, which makes the 1960s movement in addition to his ever-growing legacy. Rustin was posthumously awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2013, and the A. Philip Randolph Institute advocates for his cause today. While others spoke of grand ideals, economic justice, equality, racial integration, Rustin plotted the course to achieve them.